Hi, good evening. I'm Lee Glazer. I'm the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at the Colby Museum. And it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's conversation among artists and scholars and moderated by Lunder Institute Fellow Phong Bui. They're going to be exploring the idea that artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy. This idea is the guiding principle and the very long subtitle of the Occupy Colby exhibition. And if you all have not yet seen it, the museum's open house tomorrow evening would be a good time to do so. The Lunder Institute for American Art was established in 2017 through the generosity of Peter and Paula Lunder, whose support had already made the Colby College Museum a destination for the appreciation and enjoyment of American art. The Lunder Institute aims to extend and amplify that mission by inviting visiting artists, research fellows, and museum professionals to engage with Colby faculty and students, networks of institutional partners, and other creative and scholarly collaborators. Tonight's panel is part of a recently launched Institute initiative focused on the environment and climate change. And it comes out of Colby's longstanding commitment to multidisciplinary environmental studies and stewardship, as well as a growing interest in ecological consciousness among practicing artists and historians of American art. So the topic, as you all know, could not be timelier or more urgent. So let's get to it. Jessamine Bottario, the Institute's postdoctoral fellow, will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Lee. As Lee said, my name is Jessamine Bottario. I'm the Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Lunder Institute for American Art. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It is my honor and pleasure to share with you a few words about Phong Bui, the Lunder Institute Fellow for 2019. Phong is an artist, writer, and curator, as well as the artistic director and founder of the Brooklyn Rail, a journal devoted to art, culture, and politics. As befits a man of many talents, Phong's engagements with the Lunder Institute encompasses a wide array of activities. During his residency this week, Phong is meeting with students, faculty, scholars, writers, farmers, educators, and artists throughout the region. Next month, the Lunder Institute, the Colby Museum of Art, and the Brooklyn Rail will co-publish The River Rail, Occupy Colby, a special edition of the magazine that connects the dialogue surrounding climate change to the Colby community. The special issue is guest edited by 3 Colby faculty members, Carol O'Neill, Denise Bruesewitz, who is participating in the panel tonight, and Chris Walker. The compilation features essays by Colby scholars across the sciences and humanities with content from guest contributors. And of course, the reason we are here tonight, Phong co-curated with Diana Tweet, Occupy Colby, Artists Need to Create on the Same Scale That Society Has the Capacity to Destroy, Year 2. This exhibition is on view at the Colby Museum of Art through January 5, 2020. In addressing climate change, Occupy Colby continues an initiative launched by the Brooklyn Rail in 2017 at Mana Contemporary, Jersey City, hence the year 2. Our show here is a satellite exhibition to the one organized by Phong and Francesca Pietropaolo at the Chiesa di Santa Maria delle Penitenti as part of the Venice Biennale. Tonight's conversation serves to amplify the general issue of environmental crisis, a theme rendered visible by Occupy Colby. We are fortunate to have 2 of the exhibiting artists from the show here with us tonight. Alexis Rockman is an artist based in New York, and his paintings envision future landscapes affected by climate change. His most recent solo exhibition, Great Lakes Cycle, is traveling across 6 venues and will next be seen at the Weizmann Art Museum at the University of Minnesota. Allyson Vieira, also a New York-based artist, uses contemporary building materials and plastic waste to explore the relationship between form and material across time. She is an assistant professor of foundations at the Corcoran School of Art at the George Washington University. Joining Phong, Alexis, and Allyson are 2 Colby faculty members. Denise Bruesewitz is an associate professor of environmental studies. Her research interests include aquatic ecology, biogeochemistry, and ecosystem ecology. Most recently, and as I mentioned earlier, she co-edited the upcoming edition of the River Rail. Keith Peterson is an associate professor of philosophy. His areas of expertise include philosophies of nature and environment, value theory, and philosophical anthropology. His book project, A World Not Made for Us, Topics in Critical Environmental Philosophy, is forthcoming from SUNY Press in 2020. With Phong acting as moderator, our panelists will engage in conversation with one another and also take questions from the audience. And with that, please join me in welcoming Phong, Alexis, Allyson, Denise, and Keith. Thank you.
Forgive me, I'm not exactly myself because it was a brutal night last night. It was late, 3 in the morning, and then having to get up this morning at 5:30 to be here. But on the way driving here this morning, I was thinking from the very beginning of time, starting with cavemen of the old Stone Age, sort of tail end at the Ice Age, which spanned, I think, 125,000 to 45,500 years to the present. Human beings have always had this great desire to comprehend, to mediate the two different worlds, the visible world and the invisible world. Just as much as we're trying to figure out a way to understand or at least lessen the gap that thrive between the Cartesian space, between mind-body, predicament. It's the same way that I remember way back, if you think about cave painting, for example, even though some people have argued it was conceived as sculpture first, because the cave wall, the natural surface, irregular surface, from which certain protruding sectors will certainly lend itself to a perfect bison's body, seen in profile, running, which associate to the body action, so to speak. And I think we can also think of the handprints in the cave as a signal, or at least a desire for authorship. But we didn't understand and learn to appreciate cave paintings until modernity. This is something we forget. But I wanted to emphasize a little bit more on something that we always know for fact is a need to document things, a need to understand how we live and what we do through different time throughout the ages. And that's embodied in a way through a work of art, an object. And to me that's very interesting to see how it records throughout different time, as I mentioned. But I was also thinking how things got separated. When did that happen? Because as we were put on our collateral project in Venice, as part of this year's Venice Biennale, with the same theme, it's the same month that the world is celebrating Leonardo 500 years anniversary, and the time when someone like Leonardo, who were both artists and scientists, at the time in the Renaissance, you couldn't separate the two. Art and science has always been the same way. And so I was thinking about when did this thing happen, the separation. So much of it have increasingly even more impossible, I would say. So as an immigrant coming to America in the 1980, when I set foot in Bucks County, Langhorne, Pennsylvania, I was horrified. Gradually come to New York and learning about the culture, and I realized America is a pendulum swing in its political extremity. It's like two cowboys shooting. I was talking to Sharon at lunch today, shooting at the OK Corral. You know, either you do or die, or you win or you lose. You know, everything is so black and white. So every decade, it seems to me that just made in order to repudiate the previous one. The 50 was a repressive measure, so much censorship going on. Right after the American had been won, helped to win, defeat Nazi Germany, and succeed in the British Empire, more or less. The 60 exploded with all the things that we remember through images. And I grew up in Vietnam. I remember images of the naked young Vietnamese girl running away from the napalm bomb. I remember seeing the shooting at Kent State, and all the related horrific images. But I learned about the civil rights movement. I learned a great deal about the women's rights movement. And then some point, when I came to the US in the 80s and learning through it, I realized it was the decade of the 70s that really put a lid of those events. Once we had public intellectuals, there was, I think Noam Chomsky is a few that really go out and protest with everyone else's. But in those days, you have everyone hand in hand with all kinds of strikes of walk of life, working people, working class people, protesting all these things. So the image is no longer accessible. And I was talking to a good friend, David Levi Strauss, about this. You know, if we think about the bombing of Baghdad, for example, we don't see the horror close up because it's been censored. All we see is the same vantage point of view where it's being depicted as if we are seeing Turner, the burn of the House of Parliament, mixing in with the 4th of July. And I was horrified thinking about all these things, but why does it have to do anything with this show? Because of the election of Donald Trump. It horrifies me and all of us. And I can only speak to the anxiety, level that I remember very clearly. What can we do to bring people together, do something about this? So, as Lee mentioned, the show at Mana that I curated in a month, in which Alexis was part of the participant artists, and that show was the first time we adopted this neon work by this LA-based artist named Lauren Baum. And they say artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy. So now it became the title of all of our Brooklyn Rail curatorial project. So in this instant, it has to do with, of course, climate change and environmental crisis and global warming and so on. And I wanted to bring this up just to briefly to frame in the context of it, because the singularity, the way that had been black and white extremity in political life, had made me think even further of what can we do to counter the vulgarity, the abusive use of language. And we have to be equally aggressive, but we aggressive in a way with subtlety. And this is where poets can do it, writer can do it brilliantly, and this is where the artists can produce similar images that have both similar power, whether directly or indirectly. So the whole idea of bringing the 7 art together have early roots. We know this about the Renaissance. We remember reading Giordano Bruno, and I mentioned Leonardo. They came from the product of the writing so much of Ficino, for example, or even someone like Pico della Mirandola, elevating this importance of liberal arts. And where is it today? And I know that the former president of the college, William Adams, most people refer or calling him Bro. I only met him once. He became the chairman for National Endowment for Humanities for quite some time. And before he resigned because of Trump election, he did this amazing interview with Martha Nussbaum, the law professor and philosopher who still teaching at University of Chicago. And they were talking about the disappearance of public intellectual, of how insular, hermetic it can be when you have this academic freedom. It can go inward. So my motivation is very simple. I like to pretend as if I'm someone who, a farmer, a working person in Waterville, walking here, and I turn myself to become a moderator because I want to ask questions. So here I am. I will very simply and very haiku in my ask. I know both these artists very well, and I think I'm aware of your work a bit now too, because at UP we talk about German idealism. The first time I was here, we talk about Heinrich Heine and Goethe, but I'm going to try to be very simple. I wanted to ask Alexis why he began to paint the way he does, and when in fact the attraction for the collision between the man-made and nature.
Okay. Coming up for air. I started out thinking about these issues more intuitively. As a child, I was very aware of extinction and biodiversity crisis and the history of colonialism. And in the early 90s, mid-90s, I sought out relationships with scientists that I felt were the great storytellers of the history of the Earth and the future of the Earth. And I asked a paleontologist what he was frightened of the most, not really knowing what the answer would be. And he mentioned something about climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it. And he explained what it was, and I was chilled to the bone, to say the least. This was 1995. We were on a panel together, not unlike the one we're on today in Duluth, Minnesota, where it was paradoxically 29 below. And several years later, I started to incorporate this idea into images that I was working on and book projects, and I felt it was the greatest story, the only thing worth painting on a certain level. I've tried to go back and forth. Now I feel a sense of, gets to be a sense of fatigue after decades of thinking about these issues, and there's an end game professionally, so I've worked on other things, but I started to make paintings about imagining Central Park as under these conditions in 1997, and the work in the show is a continuation of that. One is about New York City, street I grew up on 82nd Street, between York and East End, and the other is Epcot Center, which I hadn't been to until I was there with my wife and my stepson at a basketball tournament at the ESPN Center several years after I made that painting. So that's how I started thinking about it.
Yeah, but when did you were more aware of how to assimilate scientific facts?
Well, I always felt that I've been attracted to certain types of iconography. I grew up thinking I'd be in the film industry somehow because, as you mentioned about the 70s, there was very little room for the iconography I was interested in. And, I grew up with movies like Planet of the Apes and the Statue of Liberty and ideas about, species and their life cycles, and as much as that's an allegory of many things. And I'm attracted to your interest in the history of activism in terms of race relations, women's rights, gay rights, and I always felt that what I was doing as I got older and older, I was trying to tap into that as something that I could do with my paintings. And I have I have a lot of ambivalence about the bubble that we're in, and as much as I appreciate that everyone came out to this panel, I feel there's a limitation to that because we're preaching to the converted mostly. And I thought back to a movie that I saw in 1978 that really affected me, not so much in terms of its message, but how effective it was, which was the China Syndrome. And I felt that however we feel about nuclear energy now, there was a sense of danger about it that I wish the culture, I mean, recently I'm a little bit more hopeful in the last 6 months, but there was far more urgency about nuclear energy in 1979 than there was about climate change in this country, which I find ridiculously appalling. So I think that some of the hopes that we have, I mean, we can talk about how late it is and the physics experiment that we're in terms of the planet, but in terms of getting messages across, I felt that about 10 years ago that the real way to get some of these so-called activist ideas across might be better served in different platforms like movies and streaming services. So I've tried to pursue those in the last, say, 6 years to try other avenues to get information out there.
Thank you. That's
We'll see if it happens.
no,
Anything can
you've
happen
been
at any
traveling.
time.
You've been traveling a great deal to talk about the work as much as
I try to, yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a form of activism.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexis. What about you, Allyson? I mean, when in fact in your work that the attraction for recycling the materials that you use, trash bag, all types of plastic, and thrown away things, really, debris, and then you were able to make that part of the materials in the work.
I never use the word recycling to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think of it as like transmuting it, or it feels sort of alchemical instead of chemical, mostly because I don't really know what I'm doing. And so I feel like a bit like an alchemist, throwing stuff together and seeing how I can get it to stick together and seeing what sort of stable end product I can come up with. But I sort of came to working with plastics because that's actually a really new turn in my work, as you know. And I sort of came to working with plastics through my earlier work, in which I was sort of always looking towards like the deep past and thinking about materials sort of on a geological scale. And so after spending a long time looking backwards, I started looking forwards on a geological scale. And so, well, I guess this is a backwards thing too, but I've been thinking a lot about the Carboniferous period and that sort of great extinction. And so I think about these plastic works sort of as hypothetical future artworks, or sort of like prototype future artworks, thinking on a geological scale, 100 million years from now, 300 million years from now, if there are beings on this planet who want to make things like we like to make things, what are they going to be making things of? And what that may be is the sort of remains of all of this, crushed under a time and heat and spinning planets and Lord knows what else. So for me, thinking about I thought a lot about stone carving and the history of it and things like that and archaeology and all of this. But then I thought, well, where does the marble come from? Where does the limestone come from? Well, those are seabeds and back. And so then sort of extrapolating forward. That's sort of how I got there.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a different entry point. I sort of think about it not as, I know we're talking about environmentalism as this major moral question, and I, of course, live that in my life, but in my work, I try to take a kind of amoral approach, because when you're talking about hundreds of millions of years, morality sort of blows out the window because humans also blow out the window at that sort of scale.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully.
So profound pessimism. But
No, it's not pessimism. It's reality, And then the sun will gobble up the earth, and it'll all be fine.
Yeah. But okay, so unlike Alexis, exploration of images that most viewer or most of us, we will be able to identify the narrative,
Yeah.
what's happening in that space that he's trying to depict. You actually explore much more on abstract realm. All those, occasionally we will recognize at the four works here. They are sign, symbol of the arrow. Can you share with us how did that actually operate?
So the materials always come first for me. As I said, it's like I sort of entered this, like I would think of it as like my Mr. Wizard phase in the studio. Those works are actually made of dissolved styrofoam and plastic bags. Some of the plastic bags are really prominent, some have actually had acetone transfer of print, and some are sort of collaged within the dissolved styrofoam. And so it was fooling around with the styrofoam that came first.
Yeah.
So there's a certain number of forms and a certain type of form that can be made. There's a whole lot of forms that I can't make, right? Because I'm just operating with like high ventilation, don't worry, everything's safe. Very high ventilation, excellent respirators, full like hazmat gear. And in a completely low-tech environment.
Yeah.
What can I do with the stuff that I have here?
Yeah.
So I can make these weird sort of, I think of them like potato chips. It eventually will harden after you dissolve. It turns into this beautiful sort of silken goo. And then it hardens into more of a Pringle or like a, what were those ones that were sort of like Funyuns? You know that Funyun texture? It's like a
Sun chips?
no, it's a little foamier. Oh, like the shrimp chips.
Shrimp chips,
Like the
yeah.
shrimp chips. Yeah, it's really like that. It has these big bubbles in it.
Delicious. Shrimp chips are delicious.
Yeah, the color is a little.
0.03% shrimp.
Yeah, exactly. It's mostly dissolved styrofoam. Yeah, 97% dissolved styrofoam. But yeah, so there's a material reality,
Yeah.
and I love working with material realities.
Yeah.
It sort of puts constraints
Yeah.
on something in a world where we're allowed to do whatever the heck we want
Yeah.
as artists. Material reality gives me something to root into.
Yeah.
So that's why they're sort of flat.
Mm-hmm.
And then the arrow form, that's new. I was originally making them in sort of quasi-lumpen rectangles, as one does, because, painting. And then I sort of moved into the arrow form. And the arrow form has a lot to do with the superstructure that it's within, the installation of the scaffolding and debris netting. And that's sort of coming from another angle. And then I live in New York, I live in Manhattan, and walking around the urban landscape, my daily walk everywhere, whether I'm in my studio, going to my studio in Queens or walking around my neighborhood downtown, I am constantly, the experience of being a pedestrian is navigating sidewalk bridges, scaffolding, and debris netting. It is the urban landscape that I live in. It is what I am within more often than not. We like to think about the urban landscape as being this sort of grand skyscraper, glass tower, or Beaux-Arts building, or whatever. But actually the lived experience is this sort of rabbit warren, rat's maze, sidewalk bridge. And so really thinking about how to incorporate an aspect of the lived experience of architecture within that. And so, of course, within all of this sort of sidewalk structure, what's happening within it is the destruction and rebuilding of, this New York City is like is constantly wiping itself clean and rebuilding it. There's, it's just perpetual churning of stuff.
Yeah.
And our experience of that is this form that we have to walk through.
I find it interesting because your condition dealing what you've been doing with the material, with images, however abstract, it's really about the urgency of the now. It's a present where what, in a way, Alexis is imagining of the future. So there's now and then the future. Very interesting aspect to have both of your work to reveal that differences in the show. But you mentioned the word alchemy, alchemical. which we know in the early time where it's particular beginning of the Renaissance, building of humanism, Hermeticism and alchemy were ecologically integrated. It meant that the care for Earth, the care for human being, and the cosmos. Basically, it was about the attempt to bring it into one unity. That's what alchemy meant, and Hermeticism really meant. And we know we talk about German idealism, we talk about even continental philosophy, tracing from, I remember we mentioned about Hegel, Kant, and moving forward to a certain figure like Goethe. Did we talk about Caspar Friedrich too? Throw in a few images from that period?
You might have been talking with Bradley, Rory Bradley, about that.
Yeah. Maybe too many drinks that night. No, we talk about that. But no, tell me, in your own scholarly study of continental philosophy and environmental philosophy, can you share with us what exactly the interest and how they hang together, how they intersect?
Sure. So I was trained in a graduate program in continental philosophy and started doing environmental stuff seriously after I graduated. The two fields don't really have a direct or intimate connection, although you can certainly build one. The way I got into it was by first writing a dissertation on Kant and German idealism, and subsequently studying Schelling's philosophy of nature, and I started looking for some sort of contemporary expression of that desire that Schelling had to approach nature otherwise than in a mechanistic, materialistic, reductionistic way. And I found a writer named Murray Bookchin, who is the founder of social ecology, writing about German idealist nature philosophy. And that was the first way that I began to build a bridge between the two. And subsequently I learned that actually environmental philosophy, so practicing environmental philosophy led me to change my mind about a lot of things that I thought about philosophy, because I think there's a certain irreconcilability also in the two traditions, because to be an environmentalist, you sort of have to believe that there's a real world with environmental problems and people can do something to try to ameliorate those problems or solve them. In the continental domain, the ideas about the world vary, but they sort of center around this idea that we all have our own world, that we build through our meaning giving and symbolizing and human experience in it. And to a certain extent, that tradition frowns on the kind of knowledge that the sciences produce. It looks for other ways in which human beings can experience things. And so I sort of went from being, quasi-Kantian, Heideggerian, believing that the only thing that's important is this sort of human-centric meaning-giving, to a more committed environmental philosopher, which to me means recognizing that human beings depend asymmetrically on a pre-existing reality that we don't create. We certainly create meaning in it after the fact, but we don't create it.
Yeah. What do you think, Denise? I mean, in terms of what you do.
Well, so many sparks have been kind of going off as I've been listening to everyone talk. I think some of the big picture things that I'm thinking about right now are this sort of practice of art and practice of science, and that question you raised of when did those two things become separate, and thinking about that early world of alchemy. And for me, a big part of that story is the discovery of the nutrients, the elements that make life go, nitrogen and phosphorus, right? There was a time when we didn't understand that or know where those things resided in the air and in the rocks and so on. And there's something really kind of special about that intertwining moment where those things were being discovered, and it was in a world where that could happen in a space where the art was happening in perhaps the same physical space that those kind of discoveries were being made. And it may seem a little simplistic, but I think the pace of life and this way we spend our time, and as academics who are trained in a discipline now, I think we really have to create that space to have conversations across artists and philosophers and scientists to make these kinds of connections that you all are making in your work. Another sort of smaller piece that I think is really quite exciting for me is the type of ecology that I study is ecosystem ecology, and in that framework, which began really in the 1970s, which is kind of an interesting thought when you sort of lay the political piece on top of that. We use a lot of boxes and arrows, so we don't really look now this is changing, but back then we didn't really look too closely inside what was in those boxes, but we measured what was in the box, and that might have been a wetland, it might have been a lake, it might have been a forest, and we measured the arrows of what's coming in and what's coming out. And so when I think of your plastic arrows, and now a big piece of this realm of study is measuring where the plastic goes, right? So you see it in your world and in your day-to-day, and it's sort of crumbling down and building up, but it's also moving out.
Yeah.
It's moving into the marshes, it's moving into the ocean, it's moving into the rivers, and it's being, picked up by oysters and filter feeders, it's being, buried in the sediments and so on. And so thinking about those arrows is sort of recognizing that movement of the materials that we're creating and what that means for the mark we're making, I think is a really interesting thing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier, half a paragraph ago, but who's counting? About we as academics working within our sort of specialty disciplines, et cetera. And it reminded me of sort of why I'm an artist. And, there's this great artist and writer, Claire Pentecost, and she wrote about the idea of the artist as a public amateur. And that we get to, as artists, we get to sort of learn and fail in public as part of our practice. And I mean, not even fail, but sort of have the nakedness of learning in public. Yeah, thank you. See, I'm learning in public. I was like, I don't know, I'll just say naked. but in thinking about being that public amateur, I'm like, I'm Carboniferous. I'm not a geologist, my knowledge is limited, but it inspired me, to look at this and look at that. And Alexis is, talking to the people that he talks to, and sort of then going off on this other direction. And whenever we feel like, okay, well now I want to write a television show.
How does
it's like you get to do that.
Yeah, how does that work for you, Alexis? I mean, in other words, we talked earlier today about the justification to support the vision of the work, because that's how you gain momentum and confidence to do what you do. So to frame it from the very beginning, how does that begin?
I always felt that it was more interesting to try to learn something about something that you might approach intuitively or have an idea about, and then ask a lot of questions. And for instance, when I started to work on a project that I started almost 20 years ago called Manifest Destiny, which is a big painting about climate change coming to the waterfront of New York, specifically Brooklyn, I had an idea about an image I wanted to see, which is basically a flooded New York with part of the Brooklyn Bridge submerged. And then I had to go find people that could tell me whether that made sense in terms of the math and the physics, and I went to James Hansen and Cynthia Rosenzweig and a number of other people to ask them questions, and it took me on many different directions, but I was lucky enough, I mean, and this is, I wouldn't call it this a scientific method, when you have a fantasy of what you want to see, but then you have to go find the justification to do it,
Yeah.
or else it doesn't mean anything, or else it's, and believe me, I love surrealism, but that's surrealism, which is something else.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, I think, one of the disconnects that we have with comprehending climate change is that it mimics so many things that have been Trojan horses from, Paul Ehrlich through the Bible, through, The Day After Tomorrow, and we're so easily fooled and misdirected by the history of our culture to think that it's not possible, and that's one of the profoundly sad disconnects that I think we have still at this moment, especially in this country.
And so, when you see like New York City get destroyed how many times in whatever
Right.
movies,
It could be aliens.
whatever it is,
on the
it's always
planet,
fine,
you know.
and it's not fiction this time.
Right, so there is that disconnect, and I just heard something really fascinating on NPR, and I can't remember who it was, but he was an Indian author who was talking about the uncanny to do with climate change. And the idea that it mimics so many things that we've seen before, that it goes into the sort of dustbin of the impossible in our unconscious, and that's the profound tragedy of our moment.
I was talking to Sylvette, who lived in New York, born, raised in middle New York somewhere near Cooperstown. And I remember going to the museum looking at the manuscript of so many of his great stories of the stocking tales. Of course, the famous one being The Last Mohican. But we also forget that the term noble savage, was actually came from Long Island, where the poet René Chateaubriand, who saw those wonderful indigenous people living harmoniously with nature, So when Rousseau coined it, it really came from that source. There's a way to counter against the age of enlightenment, the age of reason,
But to remember that the so-called, the equilibrium of that moment is really a misunderstanding of the, Pleistocene megafauna extinction that had already happened. So wherever humans have gone, and when they arrived in North America, they brought with them the carnage and destruction that we always bring. The scale is based on our toys.
Anything you can add to that, Pete? From your, philosophical perspective, particularly one that you described the latter.
Well, it's interesting that it seems like both of you, and you mentioned this before, have a pretty pessimistic idea about human nature. Is that something, I don't know if that's true for you, no?
No, just, right, not
I mean, as we can often think about species and what is the appropriate species in biodiversity and invasive species, it's all about context. So humans are capable of amazing things, and I've a lot of hope for humans. There's a lot of things that I'm less hopeful about based on my observations about the history of humans. And Easter Island, I was wondering what the last person, or the last tree, when the person was cutting that down, how they were thinking about it. So I see there's a long tradition of things to be less hopeful about.
What do you think, Denise? Is there any evidence where a specific natural setting that has been abused, abandoned, and able to ecologically clean itself out and permeate a new growth somehow?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different paths that can take, and that's sort of a sort of long-standing, interesting area of study in ecology generally, is when you sort of walk away from a place that has been disturbed, what happens? And I think there are so many answers to that question, but maybe a short one would be that certainly it does, recover, but it's never going to be what it once was. It's something new. It's a new ecosystem that carries the mark of that history. But it certainly functions, right? It's taking in carbon, it's collecting water, it's sort of doing all those things.
Stuff lives in there.
Stuff lives in there and so on. So, right, it's a functional sort of ecosystem, but it's different because of its history.
And those are specialists that are able to do that. And it's really, and it sounds quaint to have a moral perspective on this, but if you care about biodiversity, then you're in for some disappointment, I think.
I think this question is one that I sort of have too, and I think is really interesting, and sort of how do you hold that tension between communicating a sense of hope and optimism in your work versus the sense of urgency about what is happening?
I mean, as somewhat of a veteran, for as long as I can remember, I don't know how much hope and optimism has helped. So I don't see that being that effective in America at this point. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's been a complete failure.
Okay, we'll hold that thought for a minute. One of my favorite German art historians, name is Max Friedlander, who once says, "It's easier to change your worldview than the way you hold your spoon." I know that it's super true. The last time that I did an exercise, running, was when I was running away from being shot in labor camp. But I'm hitting the gym right now, last week. So I'm changing my habit. There's hope. There's hope. I don't know what we do in terms of this show up there and the accommodating with the river rail that you guys producing with the student, all the professors of different departments, and then have the student to literally hand out those issues to the people in Waterville as part of activism. I think that counts for something.
Can I just, I want to sort of do a slight addendum to what I just said. That is to say that our generation, and I'm 57, so I can speak for myself, and I've not been the purveyor of positive news, to say the least, but I take a lot of hope from the youngest generations of activists who fill in the blank, Greta, etc. Extinction Rebellion is a group that you should all be interested in or curious about. If I don't say so, that I enthusiastically support. So I'd say to give up on this is a complete disaster, but I'm disappointed by the effectiveness that we've had as educators, artists, and whatever else has been, sort of brought to the table.
Yeah.
And its effectiveness, it's not good intentions.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about, this is about results at this point. It's not about individual failure, it's just about structural failure.
And I think that sort of disciplinarity or multidisciplinarity really plays into that. If we're not talking across these different areas, it's really hard to do that. It's really, really hard. Yeah.
I mean, it's I mentioned the 70s partly because I remember Isaiah Berlin, very famous essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. I'm sure most of you read it. Even though it was written in the early 50s, it didn't really become famous until it was included in his classic Russian thinker. I think it was published by Vigan Press in the late 70s. And the notion of the essay is simple. It comes from a line from Achilles' poem that say, "The fox may know many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And he then divided the two artistic and intellectual temperaments. For the hedgehog, who could only see the world and interpret it with one single vision. And for the fox, it requires multitude interpretation, to whom the world cannot boil down to one vision, you know. So I guess, you know, it divided into different kind of thinker and philosopher. The hedgehog, I remember, began with Plato, Lucretius, Dante, Pascal, Hegel, and then it go down to all the way to Dostoevsky, Ibsen. As for the foxes, he exemplified Herodotus, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Molière, before that maybe Montaigne, all the way down to, of course, Joyce and Philip Warren Anderson. So that's a two separate division right there. And it was very famous essay. Now he admitted he didn't intend it to be, for it to be taken seriously. But for every classification, it always throws light on something. You know, he intended as an intellectual game. But I know everyone I met had read it in that period. And that's a separation began right there. You know, you have to choose whether you want a fox or the hedgehog. It was so intense. I guess I'm more relating, for some of us, is more invested in our life in the art world. So I get the hedgehog would be Bob Ryman or Ernest Martin, you know? And for the fox would be maybe Louise Bourgeois or Joseph Beuys. Yeah, exactly. So that's how it was. But I don't know, if the world changes so much now, I think there's a different way of seeing it without having pigeonhole, whether you're going to be a hedgehog or the fox, you know. So with that, I think I'm going to try to see whether we can have you ask questions, because that's very important. And pretend you are the people from Waterville, please.
These are the people from Waterville.
Yeah, but they live here. Super protected. Hello. Okay. Let's
I am from Waterville, and could you just tell a little bit more about the river rail,
Yeah.
if you don't mind? Thank
The
you.
yeah. Have you seen it at all? Not. You haven't.
Don't think so.
Okay. So it came about 2 years ago, and we just decided to, in addition to the Brooklyn Rail, if you've seen the Brooklyn Rail, it's free, also online. It has all the political, social issues. It's a monthly meditation. For example, Few Notes, which is all about politics and social issues. And it's my editor, Paul Maddock, has able to enlist a lot of his Marxist scholar professor to write alongside with people who are writing from the prison. And then it had all the 7 arts, you know, music, film, theater. There was it's inspired by a very great magazine in 1913. It's called the 7 Arts. It only existed for 1 year, and that was my motto. I love it so much. But the river rail came with the urgency after Trump pulled out from the Paris Agreement. And I felt it was a good occasion in which we can bring in all the friends from scientific sector and the poets and some of the writers and artists. And that was the idea. It's just the expansion of the river rail with a more focus on environmental crises. And that's exactly what we do now. And these are people who contributing. You're welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your time tonight. It was a great conversation. You know, I like hearing you all talk about hope versus despair, about asymmetry, about like thinking about these like kind of distant timescales, both going forward and looking back. It makes me wonder about whether one of the questions we're really grappling with are what are the forms that help us think our contemporary moments? Like how can we actually grapple either intellectually or in terms of habit with just the scale of the destruction and the scale of what's happening. And so I wondered if anyone would be interested in talking about what forms of thought or what forms of art are particularly important for their thinking, not even necessarily which forms you're working with, but which ones like inspire you to keep grappling with the issue of climate change or the Anthropocene or however you want to kind of like phrase it. So like what is the artistic form that seems consummate to the current moment?
Science fiction.
Well, that's the uncanny valley, right? Because it's not.
It depends on what you're reading.
Yeah. But where does, anticipatory science,
Right.
journalism, et cetera, that's the disconnect. For me, at least.
What do you want to take a stab?
I think that's true. Speculative fiction is certainly important. Alexis, I'm wondering what the disconnect is?
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand.
Because, well, I think that there's still a cultural disconnect between reading about reading this information or looking at this information and framing it within the cultural history that we have, that we're familiar with this type of iconography. And I find myself doing it. I find myself secretly consoling myself that it's not possible. And I'm talking about a small reptile brain part of myself. I keep witnessing that, and I know that if I'm doing it and I'm despairingly immersed in it often enough, I try to turn it off, to have a life, so to speak, that I think that that's a serious problem, especially in America, that's avoidant of information that makes them uncomfortable, Americans especially.
I would say that Kim Stanley Robinson's 2140 is sort of the opposite of that, especially as somebody who lives in New York City. I think that it's almost an instruction manual of what's coming.
I'm familiar with the work,
Yeah.
But I also have to point out that is not, as much as the author is an important author in the history of science fiction, it hasn't permeated culture enough to have some detachment about it, because it hasn't really permeated culture enough to be part of the conversation.
Well, I was asked what I read, and
No,
so that's why I
But
responded
I'm
to.
trying to step back a little bit
Okay.
from what I'm just observing how the culture interprets the information.
Another interesting thing is that the world is not divided. Why everything is still divided? I would say, I mentioned the decade 70. The world is no longer divided, at least from the technological, social media sense.
But it is economically, and there is the vestiges of the Civil War that still define this country.
Yeah, but earlier we talked about how globalization began. We talk about how someone, in terms of the art world, Ai Weiwei, were able to mobilize his visual production, the art production, through which he able to carry on his political activism. In a way, he's more a political activist than he is making art at the moment. That doesn't say that, good or bad in that sense, but that people do different things, and I think there's a whole idea of the boomerang, You throw it and it kind of comes back to you. And I think that's happening more now with the speed than it has been in the past. I don't know in scientific, ecological point of view, but actually, John Elderfield, the great curator MoMA, is curating a show of Cézanne and ecology. We know that Cézanne, I was talking to just last night. Yeah. Well, we know something about Cézanne and his relationship with philosophy. There's so many philosophers written about him. Merleau-Ponty, Forrest Williams, and I mean, endless other people have written on him. Cézanne's Doubt was a great essay. People written about his apples, you know. We learned that he hated technology, like Heidegger hated technology. We learned that he became angry when the landscape of his beloved site, there arose a new soap factory.
In Mont Saint-Victoire.
Exactly. So the interesting thing about his relationship to ecology, the formation of rocks and certain formation of the landscape, trees and whatnot, is really something that we don't think about, because when Impressionism became a popular movement, it was not exactly only to celebrate modernity, you know, the steamboat and the train and the new boulevard being built in Paris. You know, there was all the subversive meaning to it too.
The Industrial Revolution and
Exactly. So there's always this perpetual struggle between technology and returning to nature and whatnot. But let's just carry on our question a little bit more. I don't know whether that answered your question, but we'll get to it, I hope. Yeah, Carol.
Hi. Thank you very much. This is so interesting. And I wanted to kind of go back to the title of the exhibition, and it has a kind of a manifesto-like quality, which I don't know if that reflects hope or a kind of angry defiance that artists need to create in the same scale we destroy. And then we have the De Guarelia piece right at the entrance saying, "We are the asteroid," which is a kind of an artistic affirmation of, you know, we're the problem, we are the destroying. And I look then at Allison's work, which with its arrows makes you think, are we getting like a directions, like a roadmap towards survival? Not so much. And then Alexis's work, where I see almost not so much a roadmap to survival, but a celebration of the non-survival of the human, and maybe particularly in the Epcot work where you see the boar and, is that a capybara? I'm sorry. Nutria, okay, the same family. But a kind of defiance of the kind of natural order and an absence of the human, and maybe there's almost a celebration of that the only way the world survives is without humans. So I come from a classical tradition where hope is not seen as a good, but possibly one of the greatest evils. There's a reason it's in Pandora's box. So I kind of want to know whether all of you see hope as a good or an evil, and do we need more hope or defiance at this point?
Well, let's put it this way. I come from a culture where it was ravaged by war from the very beginning. 1,000 years of Chinese domination, in and out, and then 200 years of French colonization, 25 years with the American, and even some, you know, rest in between interval. The country was split up in half and would fight against each other, brother against brothers, kins against kins. So as human nature, but as far as hope is concerned, it's hard to tell, but I always value the artist's work. When I say artist, I meant like in the Renaissance sense. You know, people like us, writers and poets and musicians, we sense things, you know, we allow that inner freedom to create form or sound or things that reflect our surrounding, you know, and that's what I meant to begin with cave art, for that very same reason. And you go back and you see these traces, there's always a way of people coming together, and whether they do it individually or they collectively do it together. I mean, there's people who have been scientists who became artists and vice versa. There's no reason why you can't come together. I mentioned the 60s for that very reason, because it was a time when, you know, earth art was very relevant. In the beginning of the 70s, when things were climbing down, actually it was earth art who were able to mobilize their work in different ways away from the constraint and the limitation of so-called studio practice, you know. And I think that may have been opened up from the Pollock legacy. I think Pollock may have been the first one who opened up the whole spatial perspective of it. And I think, to me, earth art was uniquely American. That couldn't have been done anywhere else in Europe. So in that sense, I'm not so sure hopeful or less hopeful, but wherever it is, it has to start with this country. So wherever we can do, we have to be aggressive against the Trump agenda in little thing that we can do. Maybe we get together, hopefully with people in Waterville. We have to talk to these people, what their concerns are. If you can change their mind, move the tiny bit of the needle of discourse, of awareness, it's huge. To me, that's important. You know, that's why we wanted to bring this show and the one in, you know, in Venice back to New York City, and add more artists and do the programming like we're doing with the River Rail. Bring the poet, create program for the filmmakers, the dancer, the musician, and all the 7 art together, and then have it travel to Chicago, to Miami. I don't know. I think that's what I meant about being aggressive with subtlety. Does that, I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you so much for sharing with us about your orientation of artworks. And my question is more about the title also. Like, when I was reading the title of the show, I feel more a sense of the responsibility that the artists and also the scientists then need to band together and to create a sense that to motivate society to. So I really want to ask, what do you feel about this responsibility that you carry, like you need to communicate with the society, like how you would feel that, where are your strong motivations come from, and like how you treat them also, like with the sense of the hope and also with the sense of the optimism and also pessimism, something like that. Thank you.
Didn't quite understand entirely,
Sorry.
but no, but
Yeah.
you meant scale, the perception of scale.
Yeah, I actually feel like because myself as a student, I really want to understand like how my future works. Like, for example, like what I can do for the society. So how the artists and like how the scientists and all the philosophers think about their own responsibility to motivate the society, and how you guys like you treat this sense of responsibility in your life and your work.
Well, the answer is simple. This is it. This is part of it. The fact that you asked the question, and I'm up here having a clue how to respond to it. But we are here talking, we're sharing. There's a sense of urgency here. The show is upstairs, is the embodiment, the evidence of what everyone here contribute as artists. And then everyone here will do the same contribution in their writings. And maybe you can lead your friend to hand it out when the publication is published. Would that be possible? You make sure you get her name and her contact, okay? You'll be the first to come on board.
Find out where she
Thank you.
lives.
Yeah. I also think that you're an art student here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think that, you know, as a student, it's so difficult at the beginning, as I teach, so, you know, thinking of you as if you were one of my students. I think it's so difficult at the beginning to start making art, you know, if you, I don't know what year you're in, but thinking about your first year, your second year, we start and we think about ourselves often. It's like, oh, I'm going to make things that are about me and, you know, and very like navel gazing. And it's normal, right? When you're 18 years old, 19 years old, to sort of feel that way. Because what do I know? I know myself and I know my feelings. And I think that ultimately, no matter how old you get, the work still comes from what you're thinking, but the idea is how we are able to then face it outwards, right? That it still sort of starts with a kernel that's coming from a sort of very personal reaction to something, but then it's about, okay, well, how do I like push it out, right? How do I make it not just personal? How do I have something to communicate that other people can actually get involved in and have an experience with? You know, not everyone is interested in like your student A's parents' divorce, you know, or whatever, that they feel like but how can you make it sort of, you know, more expansive to allow other people to have a sort of communicative relationship with what you're trying to communicate?
It's the same way it would apply to both Denise and Pete. You know, they're thinking about ecology, about science, about philosophy. They have to find way, particularly now with the river rail, to contribute that so that everyone can read it and understand a little bit what they do. And I think that's big. That's very huge. That's a huge contribution. Because oftentimes we talk among ourselves and we became insular. And we forget a certain specific way to be generous, which means simplicity. It's very important to have that simplicity, to be transparent and, I would say, haiku. And I think it's not easy to achieve that. And that's something we tend to forget. We get so incredibly bogged in and specialized and became more hermetic, and we forgot to talk about what we do. And I think that's very important. I think partly because learning to speak English, which I did, it taught me a great deal too. I mean, most immigrants have the similar, anxiety, to find the right word to express your feeling and what you're thinking is not an easy thing to do. And I think that's exactly why in art, in any kind of artistic endeavor, is so amazing, because we allow that to have its own freedom. Where a little bit more of what Denise does, it have a different kind of freedom. Mostly field works, which is not exactly what an artist do, which is a studio, more private space. So my idea, very simple. I think we need to do more of this. We should do it even at lunchtime. This is how we carry on and share what we do, because it's not enough just to be in the classroom and teaching the student. Actually, I want to ask you guys. I know you, so I don't need to ask you.
It's okay.
Maybe I will. But, what do you want, like, when you teach, what do you want the student to come away with? Like, ideally, what would they learn?
Yeah, well, it's hard to distill down, I would say, but I think, I teach a class on sort of these ideas of the Anthropocene and the way that humans have shaped the planet. And one of the things I do in that class of primarily science students is ask them to find a non-scientific way to explore and communicate that idea to other people. And to me, I think that signaling to a science student that that's a valuable exercise, that there's real importance and weight to it, and that it takes work, and that it takes time, and that it's a part of your work as a scientist.
It's been one of the sort of failures of the generation of the scientists.
Yep. I think in some ways it's a scary thing for a scientist to do, because it does make you vulnerable. It opens you up, and you may not be used to exploring these concepts or ideas in those ways. And I think just sort of signaling to students that is
part of the responsibility.
And part of the responsibility is to me one of the things I really hope that they take from that class in particular.
I'd like to just generally recommend that scientists and other people who use sort of data visualizations actually work with graphic designers, because, man, they're
pretty
Pretty
up
bad.
to,
And it's happening, yeah, I think it's happening more and more, and I think this is maybe one of the
Yeah.
valuable things that's happened in this moment is that, you know, many of us have looked up from our horrible charts and tables, that's true, and said like, wait a minute, nobody actually wants to look at this stuff. And how do we change that? How do we keep the sort of science strong and not sort of be too opinionated about it, but how do we communicate the meaning and the urgency behind the work? I think that's a conversation that's happening more and more in
Yeah,
the scientific
you can like
community.
inflect the design. I mean, you can inflect the results within the design, you know,
Yeah.
in a way. And the
Yeah.
way that we text messages have no vocal inflection, and so
Right.
they're constantly, we don't understand sarcasm in them. You know,
Right.
how can a
Right.
how can a flow chart be inflected or something?
Right, and I think there's a fear
Yeah.
of that.
Well, it's a fear of inflection in general. Yeah.
Pete, what do you think? What would be the ideal student coming away from having studied with you?
Well, one of the things I try to communicate in my classes is that, and because we just started the semester and I'm teaching a 100 level class, and this is one of the first things that I try to demonstrate to students, is that ideas have a history and a culture, right? A context. The conceptual frameworks are generally not things they invented by themselves. They absorb them in the native language that they speak. They're socialized into them. They're socialized into particular ideas about what's valuable and what's not. They have certain ideas about what should be prioritized over what when they're making decisions that they didn't come up with on their own. They got them from somewhere else. And so in terms of environmental questions, one of the things I think environmental philosophy and environmental humanities more generally can provide is some knowledge about those conditions under which we make claims to knowledge, like scientific ones, about the environment, and on the basis of which we, meaning some elite class up there, makes environmental policy, which leads to some sort of action.
Yeah.
So, right, under the environmental studies umbrella, you have environmental science, which is what made up of facts and knowledge and so on, and environmental policy on the other side. I think one of the things that we can use the humanities to do is reveal, assess, interpret, and understand the various kinds of conditions under which knowledge claims and policies are made. So I would like students to be able to do that by the time I'm done with them.
Yeah, one of the things that I love, and I think we should maybe end our talk
We're going to
here.
take one more question.
One more question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you for being here. I have like 4 questions. I'll stand. I have like 4 questions. I'm going to try and roll into one, so sorry if it's a little convoluted. So you were talking a little bit back about how art might be a way to break down maybe language barriers to get ideas across, maybe on a more emotional level or some other level. And this exhibition specifically is focused on the environment and creating more than we're destroying environmentally. And I'm curious, especially with the 2 artists that we have here, how explicitly you care about the message that is being distributed. I guess when I was in the museum today looking at Alexis's work, I felt like I got a very specific message about what you were trying to portray about the future, and then looking at Allison's work, I was not getting that same explicit message. And so I guess my question for the artists is, do you care what message is being received from your art? If you care, how do you try and curate that message? If your intention is just to make people think, you know, why is that your intention? It's like, I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I don't know what message you come away with, so I can't speak to that. But I make images that have a resonance for me at the time, that have multitude of meanings and reasons for existing, and I wouldn't make the same work today that I did 15 years ago or 30 years ago. So, but I can't speak to what message you walk away with. That's impossible for me to know.
Yeah, how do you feel? How did you feel when you look at the work?
I thought I got a clear message about a potential future. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah.
About a potential future that is I'm blanking on the right word, but a dystopian of what it is now. And when I was looking at Allison's work, I didn't really know what to think, and it got me thinking that I didn't know what to think. And then hearing you talk about it, it's like, that's really cool, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And so I felt like I got, I don't know if that was your message, but I felt like I got an explicit message looking at your work, and then I didn't feel like I got as explicit of a message.
I mean, there's a paradox between activism and messages, so I'm somewhere in between. As Cecil B. DeMille said, if you need a message to be delivered, call Western Union.
Yeah, and I think you're sort of picked up on a sort of ambivalence in my work, is I guess what I would call it. As I was talking about like taking the like real backseat view, I think, as I said earlier, that for me, morality becomes irrelevant when I'm thinking on that scale, because at least human morality, I don't know if morality exists outside of humans, that's a question for Keith, but so when I work, I'm usually trying to set up physical situations and material situations that I think, something you were speaking about earlier, you're talking about responding on an emotional way. For me, I like to think that we respond in a bodily way and in a very sensate sort of material way. And I think for me, that's the sort of things I try to activate within my work always. Yeah,
I would end this. John Keats had the term, it's called negative capability, which I think a way to describe what artists do. The ability to live in uncertainties, in doubts, without having a need to reach out for reason and justification. And I think that's exactly what artists do when they do it best, is when they are at ease in that condition. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Is that enough time?